Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of my Black Plague painting series. This time I'm going to be painting Clovis from the core game. I'm going to start this miniature off by first priming him with Army Painter's matte white primer. The only skin exposed on Clovis is his face, and I'm going to lay down a base coat of tanned flesh for that. The next thing I'm going to paint on Clovis is his eyes. This way, if you make any mistakes, it's easy to correct them before we get into any of the highlighting. For the whites of his eyes, I'm going to be using Vallejo's Ivory. So as you can see, I'm not concerned about overspilling onto his face, because it's going to be very easy to correct these mistakes later. Next I'm going to choose a dark grey, in this case Skavenblight Dinge, to paint the irises. Once that's done, I'm going to use the tanned flesh and just do some touch-ups. The eyes ended up a bit bigger than I wanted, but I'm going to wait until the paint fully dries and then touch them up again. For the studded leather, I'm going to be using Steel Legion Drab. There's a lot of nooks and crannies with this armor, so I'm definitely going to be thinning my paint down and using a couple coats. For the robes and shirt, I've decided to go with a 50-50 mix of Screaming Skull and Vallejo's Ivory. Now at this point I've realized that I've forgotten to paint the upper half of Clovis's body with the pig iron, so I'm going to go back and finish that now. It's important to note that Clovis has a metal gorget around his neck, and he also has 2 plates hanging from his belt. Now that the eyes had completely dried, it was time to go back and fix them. I started off with Ivory, and I slowly reduced the size of the irises by inching in my brush. I then followed up with a tanned flesh and slowly inched my brush inward to reduce the entire size of the eye. And here you can see what the eye looked like before I reduced it, and then after. For Clovis's red cloak, I wanted to start off with a deeper red than I had on hand. So I started off with Mephiston Red, and then I added a bit of Angel Green by Army Painter to deepen the color. For my mix, I used approximately 4 parts Mephiston Red to 1 part green. The red cloak on Clovis is definitely the most noticeable feature, so it's worth taking the time to make sure you have a good even coverage. Next I'm going to paint the two swords that he's holding and the shield on his back using Plate Mail Metal by Army Painter. I'm going to be using multiple colors for Clovis's hair, but first I'm going to start off with a dark base coat of Doombull Brown. This is a layer paint, however, so it will take at least 2 coats to get a nice even cover. Clovis has a lot of leather straps and belts hanging from his chest and around his waist, and for these I'm going to be using Dryad Bark. I believe I've said this in a previous video, but sometimes it's hard to tell exactly what you're painting until you start painting it. For instance, Clovis has a lot of details on his chest, including rivets, buckles, and straps. You may find, like I did, that you may miss some of these details the first time you're putting on your base colors. I'm also using the Dryad Bark to paint the scabbard of the dagger and the grips of the swords and the dagger. Clovis has a smaller strap going across his chest and a series of straps holding his shield and his bedroll onto his back. For these I'm going to be using Karak Stone. For the bedroll attached to his back, I'm going to be using Deathworld Forest. Next, I'm going to be using Glorious Gold by Vallejo. I'm going to be using this color for all the pommels and the crossguards for the swords and the dagger. I'm also using it on a small piece of ornamentation at the bottom of the dagger sheath. So for the last of the base colors, I'm going to be using Shining Silver by Army Painter. I'm using this to paint all the rivets in his studded leather armor, and I'm also going to be using it to paint any buckles I may have missed the first time. Now that all the base colors are done, I'm going to move on to the shading. First I'm going to start off with Nuln Oil. I'm going to be using this for all the plate armor on Clovis and also on his swords. For the rest of Clovis, excluding his face, hair, and cloak, I'm going to be using Agrax Earthshade. I'm being very careful when I'm doing his sleeves and the robe hanging from his waist. I only have a small amount of the Earthshade on my brush at this time because I don't want to darken these areas too much. The first area I'm going to highlight on Clovis is his armor. I'm going to be using Shining Silver to highlight all the raised ridges and all of the studs sticking out of his armor. If you started his armor with a lighter color, such as Leadbelcher, then you may want to do your highlights with Stormhost Silver instead. I'm also going to use the Shining Silver to touch up all the various buckles. The next thing I'm going to paint is the face and the mouth. The first thing I'm going to do is darken the inside of the mouth with some Nuln Oil. Then I'm just going to lay the miniature down and leave it for 10 minutes to dry. For the teeth, I'm going to be going back to Vallejo's Ivory. The first highlight I'm going to be using on the face is Barbarian Flesh. I'm going to be using this on every part of the face except for the creases around the mouth and around the eyes. For the final highlight to his flesh, I'm going to be using a 2-to-1 mix of Barbarian Flesh and White Scar. Now, I don't recommend mixing and matching the flesh tones from Army Painter and from Games Workshop. I find the Army Painter paints have a more of a rosy tint, whereas the Citadel paints are more tinted yellow. Next I'm going to do the hair, and I'm going to start by covering the majority of the hair with Squig Orange. The only parts of his hair I'm not painting are the parts where you might see the roots. Now I'm going to do a second highlight with Wild Rider Red, and this time I'm only painting the top 50% of the hair and the beard. Next I'm going to wash over the entirety of the hair with a 2-to-1 mix of Fuegan Orange and Agrax Earthshade. Once that had dried, I wanted the hair to be darkened a bit further, so I gave it a second wash with just pure Agrax Earthshade. For the final highlight, I used a 2-to-1 mix of Wild Rider Red and Daemonic Yellow. I mostly use this on the top of the head and any raised sections of hair that might be catching light. To highlight the cloak, I first created a glaze using Mephiston Red in an equal amount of water. I applied 2 coats of this, the first one covering roughly 90% of the surface of the cloak, and the second one roughly about 80% of the cloak. And obviously at this point I'm trying to avoid getting any of the paint into the deepest creases of the cloak. Next I added some pure red into the mix, and I'm going to be repeating the last process, except this time I'll be doing 70% and then 60% of the cloak. It's also important to remember to let each of your layers dry before you apply the next one. If you don't, you're just going to end up rubbing off the last layer you applied. Next I'm switching to an equal mix of Mephiston Red and Pure Red, and I'm going to add a little more water just to make sure I still have a glaze consistency. And the last step in this process was me using just a pure red for the final highlight. The final step for my cloak was to use a watered down 1-to-1 mix of Agrax Earthshade and Carroburg Crimson. I'm just going to apply small amounts of it into the creases of the cloak and on the underside of the cloak to create some deeper shadows. For the robes and the sleeves, I'm going to start off with Screaming Skull. For the next highlight, I'm going to be using a 50-50 mix of Ivory and Screaming Skull. For the final and smallest highlight on the robes, I'm going to be using pure Ivory. For the studded leather armor, I'm just going to do a simple touch-up with the original Steel Legion Drab. For the gold parts of his weapons, I'm going to use a 2-to-1 mix of Glorious Gold and Shining Silver. For all the leather straps on his chest and his dagger, I'm going to be using a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Mournfang Brown. I'm using the same mix on the grips for the dagger and the swords. Before I highlight the sheath, I'm first going to darken the inside of it with some Nuln Oil. Next, I'm going to add a second and final highlight of pure Mournfang Brown to all the leatherwork. At this point, I'm focusing all my paint on the most upturned edges. For the two swords, I'm going to darken the underside of both blades with Nuln Oil. I ended up adding 4 thin coats to the underside of each blade. And once again, when you're adding thin layers like this, you definitely want to let each layer dry before you apply the next one. Once that's done, I'm then going to add a layer of Shining Silver to the top parts of each of the blades. At this point, I'm being very careful not to let my brush cross the center ridge. Next, I'm using some unthinned Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to put an edge highlight all the way down the blade. And I'm also going to put one down the center ridge of each blade. Still using the Stormhost Silver, I'm going to highlight all the rivets on the shield, as well as put an edge highlight all around the shield. For the bedroll, I'm first going to touch up the top 3 quarters using the original color Deathworld Forest. Next, I'm going to mix in an equal amount of Ogryn Camo, and I'm going to highlight the top 25% of the bedroll. Now that all our highlighting is done, it's time to do the base. I won't spend a lot of time describing this technique because it's covered in all my other Black Plague videos. First I start off by covering the entire base with a 2-to-1 mix of Karak Stone and Steel Legion Drab. Then I draw a few flagstone patterns on the ground using some Skavenblight Dinge. Once that's done, I use a mix of beige colors such as Karak Stone, Screaming Skull, and Ivory just to color in a few of the stones. Once that's done, I paint the entire rim of the base using a dark brown, in this case Dryad Bark. And since my zombies and wolves are covered in Quickshade, I'm also going to use a layer of Quickshade on the base of the hero. Because there's only a thin layer of Quickshade on the base, I was able to get away with only 12 hours of drying time before I used a matte varnish. The final step for this miniature is just to add a bit of blood and gore to his weapons. And for this, Blood for the Blood God is my color of choice. And here we have our finished product. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I hope you found this video interesting, and thank you very much for watching.